Welcome to today's South Talk. On a day when our campus seems thrown off its usual rhythm, I am happy to be part of a regularly scheduled event that reflects the interests of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. My name is Katie McKee, and in addition to being a professor of English, I'm the director. But nothing happens at the center due to the efforts of a single individual. Associate Director for Programs Afton Thomas designs the SouthTalks series and is assisted by two graduate students, Deja Samuels, who designs the graphics, and Ashish Shrestha, who makes sure you can see this event again later by filming it and guiding it to YouTube. And we are grateful to our communications specialist, Rebecca Cleary, who let you know to be here. Thank you for coming. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to give you a quick preview of what's coming up next in the series. We're off next week, but on Wednesday, November 12th at noon, here in this same room, we will hear a talk called Greenfield Farm, From Faulkner's Mule Farm to Mississippi's Writer's Residence, led by historian Jim Gully and Mississippi Lab Director John T. Edge. They will present an overview of the history of Greenfield Farm from the time of the Choctaws until Faulkner purchased the property in 1938. Gully and Edge will explain why Faulkner bought the farm, what happened there during his ownership, and how Greenfield influenced his writing. They will conclude by exploring what happened to the property after Faulkner's death in 1962 and how the University of Mississippi came to own a portion of it. I'm just talking to myself up here because everybody has their nose in this book that they just got at the door. So what better advertisement for the talk that is coming up than that fact? Go on with what you were doing. The Center's programming theme for the 2025-26 academic year is Reading the South. Today, we're going to take that topic up quite literally by exploring the innovative, controversial 1974 textbook called Mississippi Conflict and Change, authored by James W.Loewen, but recently updated and reissued with a new introduction under the guidance of Professor Byron D'Andra Orey. Dr. Orey is a professor of political science at Jackson State University, once the chair of the department, and the 2024 president of the Southern Political Science Association. A former W.K. Kellogg Fellow, Dr. Orey has authored over 30 scholarly publications and appears as a regular political analyst for NBC affiliate WLBT, with appearances on CNN, MSNBC, and PBS. So I've got some questions for you at lunch about what's going on. His research centers on race, politics, and social justice with a focus on Black trauma, systemic racism, and police reform. I can think of no one better to have engaged the important work of revising Mississippi Conflict and Change. Dr. Orey knows Mississippi and the South, whatever we mean when we invoke that word. He began his academic career at Mississippi Valley State University, earned his PhD from the University of New Orleans, and actually began his career here at as assistant professor of political science and African American studies. He has no particular reason to recall this, but he and I were, in fact, young, aspiring faculty members here around the same time, before he decided to head to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln to see how things looked from afar. We're glad he's back in Mississippi at Jackson State and today with us in Oxford. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Orey.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy day here on campus, but I really appreciate you all for showing up. So I'm going to jump right into it. This book, Mississippi Conflict and Change, was written in 1974, and it was one of the first books to be banned in 1974. And I'm just really excited to be here because I just saw Attorney Phillips. Attorney Phillips was one of the lawyers on the Mississippi Conflict and Change case that I'll get to in a second, but it's really a pleasure to see you in person. So why was this book written? This book was written because Jim Loewen wrote the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, sold almost 2 million copies. I had to look that up, I didn't believe it. But it's almost 2 million copies, and Jim Loewen was teaching at the University at Tougaloo College. He was teaching at Tougaloo College, and one day he was in class, and he asked his students about Reconstruction. And the students replied when he asked them, well, what was Reconstruction? And they said, well, that was the period when black individuals were coming out of slavery, and they didn't really understand government, so they messed things up, and whites had to come back and redeem. And he was really, really taken aback by that. And so he said that he needed to provide more information that could equip students to be better prepared to answer a question like that. So Reconstruction is a major part of this book. Why was the book banned? One of the reasons that the book was banned because of this picture. This picture does not depict, individuals, showing ears and all the other things that took place at lynchings. But it's difficult to say this picture is a better picture than some of the ones that we've seen before, because none of them are better pictures. But this picture was included in the original book, and this was one of the reasons that it was banned. And one of the reasons that Textbook Commission said that it could not be used is because they couldn't envision, big black males in a class with white females and showing an image like this, and the white female not being able to control her classroom. So that was actually said with respect to the Textbook Commission, but this was one of the reasons that it was banned. And of course, other reasons that it was banned is because of the substantive information that was included. So the book was banned, and then the individuals who wrote the book decided that they wouldn't allow that to happen, and they filed a lawsuit for which Attorney Phillips was on as an attorney. This lawsuit was Loewen versus Turnip Seed, and one of the key testimonies came from one of the original writers of the book, Gene Middleton. Gene Middleton was actually a student at Millsaps at the time, a very good student, obviously, to be included on the book. And Judge Orma Smith asked Gene Middleton about the lynching photo. Her reply was, "Judge, Your Honor, sir." She wanted to make sure she acknowledged him as judge. "Judge, Your Honor, sir, we believe that if a child is old enough to be lynched, he is old enough to learn about lynchings." And it is said that that statement played a major role in that case. So I guess the book was good enough that someone wrote a book about the book. So this book was written about the book, and it chronicles step by step, how the book began, the impetus behind the book, as well as, the court case, so on and so forth. But Charles Eagles, formerly faculty here, was one of the ones, or was the chief author of this book. So the original intent, so I was at Jackson State University, and I got an email from Jim Loewen, and it was out of the blue. And Jim Loewen said that he was going to revise Mississippi Conflict and Change, and that he'd like for me to be a part of it. Well, the original intent was not to revise the book so much, but to bring it back to print, because it was out of print. And Jim Loewen died about 8 months after we started the project, and I moved extremely slow, so it fell in my hands. Well, we sent it to the press, and the press had reviewers to review it. First reviewer came back, and he said, "Oh, this is good. Want to see it in print." The second reviewer, not so good. He said that this book should not be published. And he said it should not be published because it didn't do a good enough a job of updating the book. Yes, he admitted that we changed some of the language from like slaves to enslaved Africans, but in his opinion, the book did not make the changes necessary to use it as a textbook. Our original intent was not really to use it as a textbook. It was really to give it to the reader, have them look at it and say, look, this is the book that was banned. That was one of the best, or not one of, that was the best rejection I've ever had. It was the best rejection that I ever had because I agreed with them if we were going to be using this book for a textbook. And so I decided that I would take on the task of trying to update the book and at the same time trying to maintain the integrity of the book, but revising some of the chapters. I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist. And as a political scientist, I engage in a lot of quantitative analysis, I do statistics, and so it's very terse. So this was a project that was really challenging. This is what my table looked like at home. My wife was not satisfied for 5 years. So originally we had a grant from Kellogg. It was supposed to be 1 year. We had to get an extension, and the next thing I know, 4 years passed, and then we were at 5, and all these books were used. So I became a historian by self-training. So as it relates to the revisions and updates, for example, when we talk about Native Americans, and this was one of the comments that one of the reviewers said, or that one of the reviewers said. He said that there was more recent scholarship, for example, as it relates to Native Americans, and he was right. James Barnett has written quite a few books on Native Americans, and one of the things I noticed in the book when he talked about Greenwood LaFleur, which was in the original book, when he talked about Greenwood LaFleur and others, he mentions how it was mixed race individuals that white and Native American, whites marrying into the Native American families, and then ceding off the land. So they were part of, working on the treaties, and in working on the treaties, they actually gave a lot of the land away, and in return, they got land, and they got enslaved Africans because they had assets, so on and so forth. So that was one of the things that we picked up when we were looking at the current literature. So in terms of updating it, we updated, as it relates to women in politics. For example, Cindy Hyde-Smith, of course, became the first woman senator in Mississippi. Alice Clark was the first a black woman state legislator. And we also updated the arts. For example, Kisei Layman, we included Angie Thomas in the literature. And we also updated the blues section. For example, as it relates to the diaspora, or we make reference to the diaspora as folks like Bobby Rush being from Louisiana, but spending the majority of his time in Mississippi, then we've adopted him as adopted son. He lives in Jackson, has been living there forever. And Bessie Smith was not from here originally. So we discussed some of those individuals who originally were not from Mississippi. We also include hip hop. David Banner, for example, is included because we thought if the book was ever used, it would be good for the students to be able to relate to more contemporary music. And then, as it relates to rock and roll, Ike Turner was instrumental in rock and roll. They wrote wrote the song Rocket 88, thank you. Rocket 88, and that played an instrumental role in rock and roll. So the point here is that we do focus on quite a bit marginalized groups, and that was one of the main points of writing the book from Loewen and Salas. And then one of the reasons that Jim contacted me is because I'm a political scientist. And so I spent a lot of time on politics in the book. For example, this set of maps represents congressional districts. And so if you look at 2, what's significant about District 2? Mississippi Delta, where the large proportion of African Americans. And so in 1962, they had a district where blacks were the majority, overwhelming majority. But they didn't have a black congressperson. Why was that? Say it again. Voter suppression, well, blacks couldn't vote. Only 6.7% of blacks were registered to vote in 1960 and 1964. So it didn't matter if you had a majority black district because they couldn't vote. Well, Voting Rights Act happens in 1965, and we had some shrewd, strategic good old boys. And those good old boys went to work. And as you can see over on the right here, District 2 is no longer a majority black district. It's gerrymandered, and it's what we call cracking in voting rights. They cracked the district up, and that way no African American could be elected to office. Now, oftentimes students will hear the word racism and not know what racism is because it's overused. But this is a classic case of institutional racism because it was upheld by the courts. The legislature actually created it, and it's a classic case of institutional racism. So this is, I think, really important in terms of teaching students as well as just individuals about systemic racism, institutional racism, so on and so forth. Jim was really about writing short scripts, writing short topics, and I just couldn't do or write a short analysis here because I was very, very passionate about this particular topic. So the Mississippi State flag, I was here in 2001, here from 99 to 01, and of course you all that were around know that in 2001, April 17th, I can remember the date when we voted. April 17th, 2001, we voted to change the Mississippi State flag. And the changing of the flag failed miserably. 65% of folk chose the Confederate battle flag, and 35% chose a new flag. Not this flag, it was a new flag. And so I was kicked in the gut because I had just come back to Mississippi from grad school, and I'm from Mississippi. And I used to get really emotional about that because it hurt so bad that I decided to leave the state. And it had to be bad because I moved to Nebraska. No knock on Nebraska. Nebraska was a good place to get tenure. So we fast forward to 2020. 2020, we have the referendum to change the Mississippi State flag, or to adopt a new flag rather. And the process worked itself out, and now we have a new flag. So this is one of the topics that I talk about in the book. Kylan Hill from Mississippi State, football player, said that he would not return to Mississippi if that flag stayed up. Economic pressure mounted. They had a Black Lives Matter protest down in Jackson, Mississippi, led by a high school student, Macy Brown. She was one of the ones that actually led that march, and it was the biggest protest since James Meredith in the 1960s, late 1960s. I also look, as it relates to politics, to what we call realignment. And in this particular graph, I show that in 1980, you had only a few Republicans. Republican senators. This is state legislators, so this is state senate. You had only a few, about 8% of the legislature consisted of Republicans. But as time went on, there was an increase in the number of black legislators. And as that number increased, you start seeing more Republicans deflect to the Republican Party. And now you see that the Republicans are in the majority. But if you look at the state legislature now, it's extremely polarized. Nearly all of the Democrats are black, and all but one of the Republican Party are white. So one thing I try to do in the book, so that it's not perceived as biased, if you will, is to provide, statements or quotes rather in their own words. So with this particular quote, Senator Stennis said, as relates to school integration, to require mixing of the races will destroy the schools. The people of Mississippi will not submit to mixed schools. These were Senator Stennis's words. We almost adopted the Stennis flag. And so if you don't understand your history, you won't understand the dynamics related to issues like this. In their own words, Governor Vardaman, a very evil man. As it relates to white supremacy, he said, if it is necessary, every Negro in the state will be lynched. It will be done to maintain white supremacy. So we talk about white supremacy in the book. We talk about racism in the book. And as it relates to the words of Vardaman, words matter. And they mattered here. We know they mattered because if we look at this trend chart, we can see that, in 1870 or 1865 or so, there weren't as many lynchings, but when blacks gained the right to vote, black men gained the right to vote, you see a spike in the number of lynchings. And Mississippi had the largest number of lynchings across the nation. But when you look at Vardaman, there's an outlier in 1885. I can't remember if that's the Meridian riot or not, but there's a riot that had an increase in the number of individuals who were lynched, so that's why that number is spiked. But right around 1900, when Vardaman made that statement, lynchings went up. So words do matter. And in this particular case, it mattered to where individuals lost their lives. As it relates to the 1890 Constitution, we moved from terrorism that took place during the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, when we had lynchings, to codified legalizing inequality, without the violence. And so we had, the literacy test, we had the poll tax, all of which diluted, or not diluted, but end the opportunity for African Americans to participate in the political process. African Americans at that time were fresh out of slavery, so they didn't have education, so they couldn't pass the literacy test. They didn't have any money, so they couldn't pay poll taxes. And also, as it relates to, just providing this information in the book, we had felon disenfranchisement. We still have felon disenfranchisement. And unless you know that felon disenfranchisement is rooted in the 1890 Constitution, where it was said that 1890 Constitution was passed for one reason and one reason only, and that was to deny the N-word from voting. And so if you don't know that felon disenfranchisement was actually created in 1890 with the 1890 Constitution, you would think that, anyone can get arrested. Anyone can go to jail. And so anyone can serve time, and if they commit one of the crimes that's a felony that fits you losing your right to vote, it can happen to anyone. But again, unless you know that the 1890 Constitution was the reason that we have felon disenfranchisement, you wouldn't know that it's rooted in racism. Now, one character that I focus on in the book is Isaiah T. Montgomery, founder of Mount Bayou. And I focus on Isaiah T. Montgomery because Isaiah T. Montgomery was a Republican. He was only one of two Republicans at the 1890 Constitution as a delegate, and he voted to eliminate blacks from participating in the political process. Well, people nowadays would say he was a sellout. But 2 weeks before that, FMB Marsh Cook, a white man who supported blacks maintaining the vote, was killed. And so I can imagine that Isaiah Montgomery thought about his life. If they killed a white man, surely they would kill him in his mind. But also, I think that strategically, Isaiah T. Montgomery knew that he could leverage that vote with economic support from Mount Bayou, as well as protection from terrorism and so on and so forth. So I don't see Isaiah T. Montgomery as a sellout, and I was convinced by Matthew Holden, who was a foremost scholar on Isaiah T. Montgomery, and he said that when Isaiah T. Montgomery gave his speech, it was a concession speech, because it didn't matter whether or not he had voted or not. Everyone else was voting to eliminate blacks from voting. So this is, I think, a really important point that I make because, people don't understand that particular time, and it's easy where we sit today to consider him to be a sellout. Emmett Till and Open Season on Blacks. Well, the original book did not have anything about Emmett Till. It only had his name in it as others. I have a theory, and my theory is that, believe it or not, I think that it was not as salient at the time in 1974. And I say that because we had gone through the 1960s, and so much had happened. Goodman, Swerner, and Cheney, so much had happened that by 1974, it was not as salient as it was in 1955, 1956, when the national media got a hold of it. So I could be wrong, but I can't see any other reason that they would have excluded it. They did talk about others that were in 1955, 56, but I just can't see any other reason why they would have excluded. We provided fairly, not very long, but we talk about the arrogance of those who killed him when they gave the interview for the magazine. Now, I wanted to show you that without prepping you. And I say that because I wanted to include this image in the book. And I wanted to include it in the book because I wanted individuals to see what it was like during that particular time and how extensive it was as it relates to the violence that took place and the violence that took place against black people. Someone said, well, you want to traumatize kids? And I go back to what Gene Millicent said. If he was old enough to be lynched, then those who are being educated should be old enough to see what that lynching looked like. But they decided that no, they didn't want to include that image, and I can understand now. I can understand. In terms of some of the contemporary topics that we deal with, so as you know, there is going to be an end in SNAP benefits, I guess, through the month of November. And here, I think this is a very, very important set of maps. On the left side, those are enslaved Africans, 1860. The darker the shade, the more enslaved Africans there were. If you look at 2020, you can see poverty today. And you can actually overlap that map and you'll get a very high correlation. I mean, poverty is across the state for sure, but in the Mississippi Delta, it's extreme. Now, what I argue, because anti-blackness it's been normalized, and even amongst African Americans, they internalize anti-blackness. So you're hearing folks say that these folks don't deserve these stamps anyway, they need to get out and work. Well, this is a classic case that teaches individuals the problem with that particular way of thinking. If you look at the Mississippi Delta, from 1860 to the current, there was never any economic development after cotton. There was never any economic development. So if you don't have economic development, then you don't have money. And so if you don't have money, you have to rely on the government. And that's exactly what we see here. I also include in the update the case of Tunica, Mississippi. Tunica, Mississippi, they had casinos to come. And the unemployment rate went from 40% to 20%. So that means to me that if you give blacks that are impoverished the opportunity, then they would actually work. And so you're starting to see in Tunica, unfortunately, you had the closing of some casinos and you're seeing unemployment climb back up. But my point is, there was never any economic development in that area, and this is just vestiges of slavery. And with that, you have a bunch of deserts. You have food deserts. If you travel down up Highway 49 from Greenwood, if you travel up Highway 49, you'll see no grocery stores, and you won't see any grocery stores. You'll see service stations. And in those service stations, they'll have some chicken, they'll have some potato logs. Well, I guess you can see that here too. But you don't have any nutrition, any food with nutritious value. And then hospital deserts. We're seeing a lot of hospitals closed now. And so that means, for example, in Belzoni, you get sick in Belzoni, you have to go to Greenwood or you have to go to Jackson, Mississippi. And now you're talking about gas, you're talking about poor people who are forced to travel, far away to get hospital attention. And then you got pharmacy deserts. You can't get your medicine anywhere in that area where they live. And then you got bank deserts. Bank deserts, as well as the lack of opportunity to receive loans, for example, because they don't have credit, so on and so forth. And then you have brain drain. This is an issue we look at in the book. Chad White actually brought this up. We have a lot of students that are leaving the state. Well, the students who are leaving the state are students from the University of Mississippi, Mississippi State. The students who are staying are from Jackson State, Mississippi Valley State, Alcorn. When you look at the allocation or appropriation of funds to those universities, disproportionately, Mississippi Valley State, Jackson State, Alcorn receive less money. So much so that Alcorn has been underfunded by $200 million over the last 20 years. And they're a land grant university. In fact, they were the first land grant university in this state. Mississippi State was after Alcorn. And Alcorn was the first, I believe land grant college in the country. So I think that's extremely important because we're not investing in those folk who stay in this state. We're investing in some students who leave the state, and we're preparing them for other states. Another thing we look at is white and black flight. If you look at Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi is 80% black now. Right around, I guess, 1970s, 80s, it was about 56% white. And you saw a lot of migration from the Jackson area to the edge cities, or they became cities. They were rural areas, and then they evolved into cities, which created what we would consider the suburbs. But this was not only whites. You also had blacks to flee. And they were going, they have the exit option, so they were leaving for better opportunities for schooling for their children, and some just were getting out of Jackson because they suggested that we had higher crime rates, and the crime rates were increasing. Either way, we have folk who migrated to the edge cities. One of the problems that exists is that you're having development, economic development in the edge cities, but suffocating Jackson. And so because the tax base has eroded, this is one of the reasons, and I know you probably have heard about it, this is one of the reasons that we have a water crisis, because we have an eroded tax, a lower tax bracket than tax base than we had before. So why read this book? I think that it equips individuals with the arsenal to combat and challenge these negative stereotypes of marginalized groups. And in doing so, it prepares them to understand when those who are in opposition to those groups mean what they mean. So for example, there was a case where an individual said that these 4 prominent women were or did not have the brain power to process information. Well, when you say brain, you're talking about biology. Textbook definition of racism is that one group is biologically inferior and another group is superior. And so when you talk about biological individual as it relates to the brain, and you talk about blacks and benefiting from affirmative action as if they didn't deserve to be in those positions when they were simply given the opportunity, but not, granted the right, if you will, or the privilege to complete their education, like some of these women that were included. They were at Princeton, they were at Harvard, and the individual who made the statement had not finished community college. So for me, it equips the individual with the knowledge to be able to recognize when we have statements made like that and to call it what it is. And it's simply racism and white supremacy. To maintain the hegemony and the dominance that individuals have, and then to suppress, for example, the vote. Why suppress the vote now? We still have redistricting issues where votes are being diluted because you're diluting or gerrymandering districts. In this particular state, whites are in the supermajority. So why continue to dilute the vote by gerrymandering the districts? Fortunately enough, we had 2 court cases where we challenged those diluted districts and we won. We won here in Oxford, we won down in Jackson. Attorney Phillips, longtime voting rights lawyer that I've known about for years, really long years, but no, not that long. But and I'm happy that you are. But what other purpose than to maintain hegemony or dominance? So this is one of the reasons I think individuals should read the book. I think it provides them with, like I said, the arsenal to combat, negative stereotypes against marginalized groups. And one thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank the Kellogg Foundation, who purchased 7,000 books so that we can give them to students across this state, because we think that the book, I don't know if you call it banned, will not be used. And one of the reasons I say that, and I'll clear this up, that the book was sent to the Mississippi Department of Education. And when it was sent to the Mississippi Department of Education, the response in a knee-jerk way was, this book is too controversial. For me, I was like, that's banned. So I took it and ran with it. I ran too quick, but NBC called, Times, New York Times called, and they contacted Mississippi Department of Education. Mississippi Department of Education said that person didn't speak on behalf of the Mississippi Department of Education. So I think we still have an opportunity to get the book in the hands of students in the classroom. And if nothing more than to have it as ancillary materials where they can use it as supplemental materials for students to be able to use in addition to the required text that they have. Thank you.